Hello, this is Zanichelli Venture's Sites on EdTech podcast, and I am Luigi Morino, your host. On the Sites on EdTech podcast, we interview entrepreneurs, academics, and ecosystem players in the EdTech field who are working on particularly impactful projects worth sharing. Zanichelli Venture is the venture capital arm of educational publisher Zanichelli Editore. Feel free to reach out to us regarding any exciting EdTech project you might be working on. In today's episode, I interviewed Libby Hills and John Soleanicov, co-leads of learning schools, one of the three areas of work of the Jacobs Foundation. The Jacobs Foundation is doing some very important work to bring about a paradigm shift in EdTech that will embed evidence into the norms of the field. So here are Libby and John. Libby, John, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us. Great to be here. It's a great platform to share our work.
Thank you.
So first of all, we spoke about, or we're going to speak about learning schools. This is your area that you co-lead together. Can you briefly explain what you're doing at learning schools as one of the three areas in which the Jacobs Foundation work is divided, and how you work as co-leads?
Sure, happy to get started. So learning schools, as you mentioned, is one of the three portfolios of the Jacobs Foundation. It's part of our current 2030 strategy. And the goal really is to improve the way evidence is used by schools to take decisions around pedagogy and around other topics of administration. And part of that is our EdTech work, which really affects, because we realize today, more than ever, technology is becoming an increasingly important reality of work happening in schools. And the evidence question is just as important, if not more important, when it comes to technology. And so we've taken a look at EdTech specifically as part of this portfolio and trying to introduce evidence in the sector so that ultimately the technology that goes in front of children is more evidence-based and leads to better learning outcomes for them. And that's a bit how we frame the work that we do.
Yeah, and I'm relatively new to the foundation. I probably can't say that after a year or so, but newer than John anyway. And one of the things that drew me to the foundation was some of this work that John's really the architect of at the foundation, and the opportunity to really build on some of the work that John had started to build in this space. So it's been a really exciting year thinking about how we can kind of join the dots between how investors operate and act in the space and how companies are building their products, and then how schools go on to actually use those products.
By the way, just to kind of give an idea, what is both of your backgrounds? Because I think you kind of bring together two different backgrounds, two diverse backgrounds as co-lead. I think this is interesting to kind of set the stage for the interview.
Yeah, I agree. We've got kind of different and complementary backgrounds with a few areas of overlap, which is really cool and really fun to have a partner like John to work with. So my background's in education and EdTech research. So I started my career as a classroom teacher myself, and then went on to take on some leadership responsibilities in a school. And I then went on to help build and run a network of schools. So, you know, a charter school network or academy school network to people, you know, who are familiar with the UK and US systems. And so I think that gives me those experiences really help to anchor me when I'm thinking about some of these questions we grapple with in the portfolio, like how can we help make sure that products are, you know, getting into schools and classrooms are actually useful from an education perspective. And I continue to be involved on the EdTech research side. So do some research looking at the applications of AI in education as well, which also is a really great complement to some of the thinking we're doing about working with investors and helping to get evidence-based products out there.
Yeah, and on my side, I started my career as an investor. I was at Lehman Brothers in New York and at the International Finance Corporation, investing in education and emerging markets. So I kind of bring that perspective to education. I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey, and then got into the education space as a practitioner by launching an NGO in Romania, where I'm from, called Teach for Romania. And so really interested kind of the business angle of education and the operational angle. And Libby is the one with the pedagogical and teaching expertise. But together, I think we make a good complementary pair.
I'm going to be very interested in exploring this business angle that you talk about, that you both, of course, have a great understanding in, and which at times has been not sufficiently held in mind when talking about education, perhaps, and which will set some of the questions that I'm going to be asking you about the market presence in EdTech. Why specifically evidence in EdTech as one of the main focal points of your work?
Yeah, I think it's, as many things with EdTech, it really got turbocharged with COVID. So COVID is this sort of strange period where all of a sudden, all the kids are at home. Parents are seeing what's happening with their education. They're seeing also the use of technology in their education. And I think a lot of people in the foundation really looked at that and said, well, there's a place here for us. The foundation's always been interested in evidence and research, and the link between research and practice has always been core to the foundation. But then seeing this kind of brought literally in the living rooms of people, it really became a topic in everybody's mind. And we thought, hey, there's a space here because there's so much hype and so much interest and so much optimism that technology is kind of this panacea that will sort of resolve all of our education problems. And when you look at it in more detail, you see that a lot of the things out there don't have much evidence. It's not clear what their impacts are, positive or negative, and yet people sort of grasp onto them and roll them out and see them as potential saving tools. And so we started to look at this as a kind of structural problem, and thought, actually, how can we take a systems approach and try to think about the kind of the specific interventions at a system level that we could engage with to try to change the trajectory of how evidence is created, how it's used in taking decisions around evidence, around education and technology.
It sounds to me like you're kind of setting yourselves to attempt to nudge EdTech towards evidence. And if I had to categorize your kind of intervention, it's this kind of attempt to nudge it in the whole industry into a new paradigm in which the industry then it becomes a norm for the industry to have to produce evidence for, well, EdTech companies and kind of adopt them in adopt evidence practices in their way of running the business. Well, I'm going to ask you in a minute to describe what the whole roadmap of the intervention is. But firstly, I'd just like to meddle a bit with this concept of giving a nudge to the whole ecosystem. How do you see this unfolding? Are you hoping that this is going to set new norms? And that's a big undertaking at the end of the day. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess in terms of what we want to see and what change we're kind of pursuing at the foundation, our big North Star at the foundation is improving learning outcomes for children. So that's the ultimate goal that we're really focused on. We think EdTech's got real potential to play a really important part in helping to address and get towards that goal. But there are also things that would benefit from change in order to really make sure that EdTech is unlocking its potential to help us achieve that. So we want to play a role in making that happen alongside other partners, and we're looking forward to talking a bit more about how we're bringing other interested partners together in this conversation. And I think what does that actually look like? So lots of people compare education to health and education to how drugs are developed. It's a very rigorous process that drugs need to go through before they get out there into the hands of people. And sometimes people say, well, look at what happens for drug development. We need the same for EdTech, for education. I'm probably have a slightly different view. So I think if we really get real about this, if the wrong drug gets into the wrong person's hands, there's a pretty high impact there. Someone could get super ill or even die. And EdTech is a bit different, right? We might, if the wrong piece of EdTech get into the wrong student's hands, we're unlikely to have a disaster on kind of that scale. So I'd probably say, maybe not as rigorous as how drugs are development and the process that needs to happen there, but certainly more than what happens a lot of the time now in terms of our ability to really understand how efficacious or how good at actually achieving its educational learning outcomes a product might be. So somewhere in the middle, I think, is what we're really trying to get to. I think a more useful comparison is maybe the expectations around audits, audit data. So it's a really key data point that companies are expected to produce. So, how can we help build an equivalent expectation for the EdTech space is something that we talk about a lot.
What do you mean with audit data in that sense?
So in order to show, the health of a business, it's a really important process that companies go through, an audit to show that they're in good financial health and complying with like key requirements, right? But we don't have an equivalent process or expectation when it comes to actually showing, is a product doing what it says on the tin? Is this EdTech product delivering the benefits that, we want it to and companies want it to? So can we develop an expectation and a process that really helps to set that as a bar that we have for the market as a whole and for companies?
I'll come back to this as it's I'm curious to understand whether you're imagining this happening with third-party service providers providing audits and how you imagine the ecosystem might unfold. But let's keep this on the side for a second and come back to this. John?
Well, I was going to say just that I think this comparison with the audit has another benefit, which is that a lot of people think that evidence is this thing you do once. I did a study on my product, it works, job done. Now I just keep going on. And actually, evidence is this thing that you have to keep doing because, as Libby said, when you do a vaccine, you test it in one place, it kind of works the same everywhere else. Whereas in education, just because an intervention is effective in one place doesn't mean it's going to be effective in another place or another context. And so evidence in education is this thing that you have to kind of keep doing on a consistent basis. And that's why we think about the parallel with audit, which is the audit you have to do every year because your investors want to know whether the financials are accurate or not. Yeah. So it's just a bit that point around recurring investment in this question of studying the impact of your product.
And what you're just saying kind of leads me to think about part of the answer that Natalia Kucherkova gave me. Our last interview was with Natalia, who's doing, very well, is doing. In fact, I think she's her work has been funded by the Jacobs Foundation. She's doing very important work on evidence in EdTech, and her answer was not only is it important in order to obtain contracts, but it's important for EdTech startuppers and solution providers to develop their solutions. So the point of evidence isn't just obtaining a contract. It shouldn't be done or obtained once you've developed your solution. It should be what is hinting you in the direction of how you're developing your solution the whole time, basically. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And one of the things that we're trying to do is build this understanding about building evidence being a bit of a journey. I think there's sometimes a bit of an assumption that when we're talking about evidence, oh, that means a high stakes, expensive randomized control trial, a really very rigorous type of evaluation. And actually, there's loads of people like Natalia who are offering a range of services that can meet companies where they're at. And if a company might be really early stage, just starting to think about how to build their evidence, we've got people like Natalia out there who can, for really small cost, be able to help them get started and help them think about, the design of their product and how that can relate to the learning gains that they want to see at the end. So I think that's a really important point that we try and encourage people to see evidence as a journey.
The point you touch upon for startups is so important. I mean, a startup cannot run a randomized control trial, at least most of the time. There are other stages of evidence, right? This is the good old Nesta publication on stages of evidence in EdTech. I think since many of our listeners are startuppers, I think this is very important to say. first and foremost, like don't be scared. You don't need to run a randomized control trial when you don't even have the users to run that on. So yeah. Before we look into how you're intervening as the Jacobs Foundation, I was curious to ask you, like, what you see as the state of the EdTech field right now. You've said evidence is not really embedded in normal practice, but can you unpack that a little bit more? I think the Jacobs Foundation did mention like a percentage of EdTech companies that is providing evidence, which was remarkably low. I don't know whether that percentage is still valid today, but generally speaking, can you tell us what you've seen while doing research on the overall EdTech field? Like, what have you found?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can start, and then John, please do jump in a true co-leadership style. So you're right, we did. So, people talk about this being a problem, we need more evidence in EdTech, but we wanted to actually generate some data, to help us really understand, well, what is the status quo? How are things looking today? And so we ran a form of assessment, looking across our portfolio companies. So we're an LP across 9 EdTech specialist funds. So that gives us a kind of group of companies to really kind of focus on and learn from. And so we ran this assessment in 2022, across those companies as a bit of a baseline for us as well. So we also have a way of, tracking the impact of our own work and seeing how we're doing, as a foundation, and how helpful we're being in the space. And so that assessment just looked across all of these companies and outside in. So without having to, ask for the input of really busy management teams and entrepreneurs, we looked across all of the publicly available data, while our partner did. That gave us, and they looked across to see, how many of these companies have a piece of evidence available, so have a study, and the number we got was 21%. So 21% of those companies, had a study available, had a piece of evidence, basically. And Luigi, you were suggesting there that you thought that's a little low. Like, we agree. So we think there's room for improvement there, which is what we're working with some of our partners on. How can we kind of work together to get that number up, basically, over the coming years? We don't know yet. We're in the middle of running the second assessment with our partner, so we'll let you know how that goes and if the numbers improve from our baseline. But that's where we're at the moment. But John, please do jump in.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, spot on. I think the only thing I would add is really a little bit what you said earlier, Luigi. There's a little lack of understanding or fear of the word evidence. I'm a startup. I have to make payroll. I have to raise my next round. The last thing I need to think about is evidence, and especially not an RCT. And I think part of it is just unpacking actually what does it mean and what are the different stages, as Libby was saying earlier, of evidence generation. And so the state of the world is really, people think you either have an RCT or you don't, and that's it. And we're trying to articulate and communicate, and we've used the asset tiers, which are from the US, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which gives a nice sort of structured view or the different stages of evidence. And the first stage is really just writing on a piece of paper a logic model, which is the theory beyond what your product is going to produce in terms of outcomes, and linking that back to things that have already been studied and showing, because of what's there in the literature, I believe that this intervention can be effective. It doesn't require any experimental data, any evaluation. It really just is articulating what you want to do. And a lot of companies don't have that because, again, it was always binary. You either have an RCT or I have nothing. Yeah. And I think we try to bust that myth a little bit and explain that it's in your interest as a company to start thinking through from the day one, really, what is your logic model? And we think that's going to actually generate business value in the long term. And I think companies that don't do that and don't think about that are probably going to struggle in the long term to gain market share and product market fit. Speaking
of which, have you even looked into procurement procedures spread across, I don't know, perhaps Europe. I don't know which, I imagine you're focusing on the European market, but I might be wrong about that. Actually, that's, I'm supposed to ask you. Have you even, when doing this research, looked into like procurement procedures? Do they ask for evidence, and what kind of evidence do they ask for?
Yeah, happy to jump in, and then John, please do add. So we have looked into procurement procedures, and just to say, so we're global, so we work globally, so in various places around the world. A lot of the work that this is that we're talking about today is concentrated in the US and Europe. So one of the reasons why we use this framework to articulate the different levels of evidence that John mentioned, it's called the ESSA Tiers of Evidence framework. One of the reasons that we thought that that's a good starting point for how we, understand where companies sit when it comes to evidence is because of how it's used, in procurement in the US. So it's a tool in a framework that, states and districts can embed in RFPs, so requests for proposals, requiring companies to show that they're aligned with a particular level in order to be able to access, federal funding. And so because of it being used and embedded as an expectation in some procurement processes, it creates an incentive, for companies to actually align with it and have that evidence, because there's a commercial advantage to doing so. It's a little bit more challenging when outside of the US in terms of, procurement processes and how they look, just because of the fragmentation across markets. But yeah, John, maybe you can jump in here to talk a bit more about what we see there.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So first of all, there's the, how did EdTech products get sold? And what we see anecdotally, it's, the teacher asks somebody they know, what product do you like? And that's the decision is made. That's kind of what we hear a lot in the US. Then procurement is actually in Europe, it's very centralized often, right? It's the government will do a tender, and the question is, in that tender, what's the part of evidence that goes in there? It's highly variable, honestly, and I think still not enough present. And then you look at the sort of the rest of the world, or the developing world, where really there's just not a lot of procurement happening, and that's why you see less depth of EdTech. Now there are other problems there: teacher salaries, the retention, the other sort of essential issues. You don't see EdTech companies trying to sell to schools in developing world have a very tough time. I mean, that's the reality, and that's why you see less developed markets. But even there, we think there's a role, because in these markets you see philanthropy playing a role, you see bilateral donors, and there actually evidence is rarely flagged. And so even in a developing country, there's a relevance for this work. It may not be in the typical venture financing, school purchasing model, but evidence is still necessary and lacking. And so we see that as part of our role when we work globally.
And I guess here we're focusing on EdTech companies that are developing solutions for schools, for universities, perhaps, not necessarily EdTech companies that are targeting parents and students themselves, right? But still, they're actually a big chunk of solutions in EdTech. And then how are parents able to like kind of filter through this information or information asymmetry in being able to recognize what is backed by evidence and what isn't. But okay, let's hold that back for a second. I'd like to ask you about your intervention roadmap so that we can kind of like have an idea of what's going on before we go on with so many interesting questions.
Sure. So I have a visual. I don't know if I'd call it a roadmap, but it's sort of laying out what we are trying to do with this work in EdTech. So it's really a three-pronged approach. We like acronyms at the Jacobs Foundation, so there's always an acronym tied to everything. So we really started with the center part here, LAIF, the Learning EdTech Impact Funds, and we said, hey, can we invest in EdTech? And really, this is commercial investing. This is an investment that hopes to generate a return, commercial return. But by these investments, the goal is that we influence the funds in which we invest. And we're seeing anecdotal evidence of that already. We engage deeply with all of our managers. We explain to them our interest in evidence. We sometimes get certain clauses inside letters that commit them to certain principles or or activities that have to do with evidence. And so the returns that come from this actually go to fund the left side, the CERES, the Connecting the EdTech Research Ecosystem. And this is just, you can think of it as a consortium of leading researchers in the space, really pushing the frontiers of research with a very clear research agenda around learner variability. And the goal really is to connect these two, to connect researchers to companies. And there are really two very distinct and different worlds on different time scales with different priorities, different principles. But when you bring companies together, the researchers actually, you get one, better validation of the product and of its efficacy, and you get research that's more applied, because a lot of the problem with some of education research that it's a little bit ivory tower, it's not often applicable. And so connecting these two kind of creates a virtuous cycle. And then we take all this to say, can we influence really where funding is flowing? And so we went to look at all our funds and who else has invested, the other limited partners in our funds, and we brought them together in a community that we're calling EdFirst. So that's EdTech Foundations Investing in Research and Systems Transformation. And it's a kind of informal, formalizing group of investors. We meet 4 times a year. One of those times is physically, and we exchange learnings, and we really think about how can we act together to achieve some of the goals that each of us individually might have a hard time doing. So each of us, especially us as the Jacobs Foundation, we're never really a major investor in these funds, but together with some of the other investors, we think we can put on the table certain topics that are of importance and of value, and hopefully move the sector in the right direction. Now, I think the last thing I'd say is this whole setup actually has a zero cost to the foundation, because the returns that we generate, ideally from the investments, go to fund the research activities and the minimal cost in EdFirst. And so that's kind of the theory behind it. And obviously, there's a long time horizon here. We've pre-funded some of this, but the idea is that when all is said and done, it's kind of a net zero to the foundation, which is a nice, when you propose to the foundation and we do this program, it costs zero. It's a slightly easier pitch than otherwise. So that's a bit of the theory of it, and we're thinking on a good track. We've learned a lot along the way, making pivots, but generally I think we're in a good direction to get where we want to be with these 3 interlocking programs.
Before I ask Libby what she'd like to add to all of the picture that you laid out, John, just a couple of dates. Could you tell since when has the CERES been operating, and since when LEAF has been operating, and so on?
Sure. Everything really started 2020. I think our first investment was at the end of 2020, and that's when we set up CERES, probably early 2021. We're in a 2030 strategy, so this will go on to 2030. Then obviously, I think some of the investments will go beyond that, and I think that's fine. Hard to say exactly what happens post 2030. We think this work is valuable and should continue, but for the time being, the mandate we have is to 2030.
So Libby, I imagine you might want to add some parts of what John described.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're getting used to our co-leadership vibe here. Yeah. So what I just add is that this sort of challenge, I think, that John mentioned about it not always being that easy to find academic researchers and pairing them up with companies who might be interested in building and understanding and building their evidence base, which makes sense, right? Because they have different goals and different incentives, and so that's why I think it's not always straightforward to find for that to happen. But what we have been doing is really trying to find partners who are really good at understanding the realities of both worlds. So how to conduct really valuable research, but how to do it in a way that's practical, accessible, and is aligned with the day-to-day realities of running a startup, which is busy, tough, like founders are time poor, so are their teams. And that's where our partnership with Natalia and Wicked comes in. Natalia's been a really great partner for us and for companies to really help them get started and build their evidence base, because she's really addresses some of those challenges that we sometimes find. And we're also working with a few other partners who offer similar services to Natalia as well. So Lean Lab Education, WestEd, and also Learn Platform, now part of Instructure. So we're, it's been really great to see the value that startups have found from working with, research organizations like this. some of the feedback that we've had, you know, there are benefits I think people find for their communication and marketing and sales, but I think the feedback we're particularly excited to see is when, you know, founders and their teams feedback that it's really valuable from a product development perspective, that, you know, going through this process with someone like Natalia to really think about, you know, how their product works and, you know, works in a classroom to really deliver a benefit in a school has really helped them to strengthen their thinking about their product, you know, and their roadmap and how to keep building it in a way that's, you know, efficacious and popular. So that's always really exciting for us.
I think I'd bind to what you were saying earlier about third parties kind of running impact evaluations, I guess, or audits. You were mentioning audits earlier. Are those the partners and perhaps others that you didn't mention who you were thinking about when you were talking about audits earlier?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think any of them would describe themselves as like evidence auditors, but they do you know, really great job of helping companies like figure out where they're at, you know, in terms of their evidence, and then helping them to build on where they're at. So whether that's doing the work that John was saying, so, you know, putting on paper a logic model, how it all fits together, whether it's doing some like usability, feasibility testing, you know, something a bit more advanced like, you know, correlational studies, so something that's starting to really look at you know, what types of impact do we think this product might be having, you know, and then, you know, we do help companies move up to some of that more rigorous stuff when they're ready to, when they've already done some of that foundational work.
Yeah. John, you mentioned you've been operating the projects since 2020, and you also mentioned that the whole group is basically self-funding because exits from your investments should be able to fund the whole thing. I assume that's what you hope for the future, because I mean, how many exits have you in fact had any exits yet already since 2020?
Yeah. So that's a good question. When we started discussion, that was the foundation asking, you know, when are we going to see the money back from these investments? And so I think the first thing to say is when you do venture investing, generally any sector, you need to have patience because you're investing in early stage companies. It takes some time. I mean, even if you invest in Facebook, right, at the early days, by the time you get your money, it's gonna take some time. Now you multiply that when you talk about education, because these are sectors where the life cycle is longer and it takes longer to get your money back. So, and actually when you want a return, you don't want to see early exits. Generally, early exits are a sign that maybe you sold, you know, not high enough, or sometimes early exits are associated with not a suboptimal outcome. And so we've had a couple, I would say, distributions. You know, we're not invested in the companies, we're invested in the funds. We had some distributions, but nothing sort of meaning. And I think I don't expect anything really substantial to come for a couple more years. I would say we are diversified from a vintage point of view, even though we did all the investments in 2020. Some of the investments caught funds that had been investing for some time. So we have some 2019, I think 2018 vintages, and then some of them were just in the process of raising. So I think we have a 2023 and 24. So we're invested, you know, quite diversified from a timing point of view. But I think it will take time to actually see money coming back. And actually, we have this debate with Libby. Probably what the sector needs is actually more time and more patience for exits and liquidity, and not less, because in this space, just the times are stretched out. And so you probably need funds and LPs with a longer time horizon to really provide the needed capital to some of these enterprises. And people who want to see the money back in 5 years, you know, they're not a good fit for investing in EdTech, honestly.
Yeah. I think this is a common, I guess, answer to this question when we're talking about EdTech. Do you define yourselves as an impact fund?
You know, we have the luxury of not having to go raise money, so then we don't need to really brand ourselves in one way or another, right? I think people will use the impact word or adjective if they were trying to get money from somebody. So we've not, I mean, we have an I in the acronym. And now you can, you know, make what you want of that. We have funds that call themselves impact funds among the 9, and funds that say please don't use that word when you talk about us. So we have those extremes. And even the sort of the what does impact mean, I think, is a question. But for us, right, if you think of impact as evidence of impact on learning outcomes, then yes, in that sense, we are impacted. We are seeking to, generate and improve impact on learning outcomes, and so in that sense, we are an impact fund. But if by impact fund we mean we accept concessionary return, then we're not an impact fund. Because really, the idea is that we are, again, we need to pay for all the other parts. So we need to generate a commercial return so that we can make the whole thing work. And if we are generating a concessionary return, then it does, the math will not work. So in that sense, we're not an impact fund. So ultimately, kind of the answer that I always learned in graduate school, the answer to any question is it depends.
Did you want to add anything to that, Libby?
No, thanks, but yeah, fully agree.
I'm wondering. So this is the goal we were talking about since the very beginning, to kind of change the norms in EdTech, is a big objective. Maybe even pulling back out the graph that you were using before. How exactly do you see this happening throughout your intervention and other natural evolutions that are happening in EdTech, in the field as a whole? So kind of revisiting your roadmap with kind of talking us through how you think that this will aid the final objective. Of course, rewarding startuppers who put emphasis on evidence since the very beginning. That is self-explanatory, I guess. But can you kind of walk us through your whole concept of how this is going to take from A to B, and B being kind of the objective that we spoke about, especially with Libby at the beginning of the interview, of how the education of tomorrow hopefully is going to be compared to today?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Libby also, I welcome your thoughts to add. I think it's a systems approach, right? So really thinking, okay, in the world of tomorrow, what you have is products like, schools and school systems are using technology in ways that is evidence-based, right? So they're not just purchasing gadgets and nice and shiny things, but they're purchasing things that enhance and amplify the impact of teachers. So we don't believe in replacing teachers with tech. I think that's kind of, most people would agree with that now. So it's technology that has clearly evidence, and evidence is the thing that continues to be collected. So I was saying earlier, this state of the world where schools and school systems are purchasing, using evidence, companies are constantly producing evidence on their products. Those that are not be able to provide evidence are uninvestable and cannot sell, or they pivot and adjust their product so that it is evidence-based. So that's sort of the B, to use your terminology. And how we get there, there's a part of this around regulation and decision making in public systems. Obviously, that's a much more difficult nut to crack. We think about that in some of the countries in which we work, but that ultimately is a big task, and especially if you work globally. But I think we are thinking more on the market side. If you have investors and companies all talking about evidence, that at least the supply of EdTech is really evidence focused. And part of that may involve just providing more data into the system, right? Like we mentioned the percentage, really, packaging that into a report that produces data to all relevant parties on where is the evidence, where does it say, which companies have it, which don't. Provide, there's a lack of information. I think you used the word information asymmetry. That is, both for parents, both for purchasers. One of our funds, they had an article in the Stanford Social Review talking about EdTech as a lemons problem, right? So they're using sort of the economic theory that you can't discern between an impactful EdTech and not. So what happens is the impactful ones get crowded out, and the unimpactful ones are the ones getting all the money. So I think this problem with more information, and that could be our role going forward, this problem can be solved just by putting more information out there and allowing different market participants to use that information to take better decisions. I think that's sort of where we see our direction. going. But I think as an investor, it's important to be there because we understand firsthand how these decisions are taken. I think consolidating and convening the key investors in the space is also going to be a continuing important element. And the research side, which is core to the foundation, advancing the frontier of research. All those three elements, I think, are going to continue to be essential for us as we try to get closer to this desired state of the world. Libby, please add in if I missed anything or if you have anything to add.
No, it's great. I mean, just to get into sort of like a little bit nitty gritties, just to get, specific of what that actually looks like. So, through the EdFirst Alliance, we're having conversations with other LPs like us and, people who are, all of us are interested in these topics. What do we mean by evidence? It's important, but what does it mean? How do we measure it? And so there's, real conversations happening about, hey, well, maybe this way of assessing where companies at in terms of evidence, maybe more than one of us should be doing that. And so rather than us all having slightly different conversations with funds and our investees about the same topic, we're starting to speak with, more with one voice and more consistently, with the thinking that combined, we have more chance of actually making a difference. And also it's just more efficient and easier for our investees rather than having to have like 5 different types of conversations. That's just kind of like practical to like bring to life a little bit what that actually looks like in EdFirst. And on the evidence side, it's, how can we make evidence, more accessible, make companies more aware of these options like Natalia and Wicked, that they exist, that they're helpful. So that's sort of some of the work we're doing on that side.
I guess to kind of bring to a close our interview today, do you have any announcements on like your work that you'd like to share today on any of your initiatives?
We'd love to give you the nice big secret announcement of the big amazing thing we're doing, but unfortunately we're not. We don't have anything that we haven't shared publicly at this time. So anything that we're doing is kind of out there. Sorry to disappoint. I hope people who have been waiting this whole interview for a big announcement. But people should stay tuned. We are continuing discussing internally different things and different ideas, and there may be news to come. But nothing, unfortunately, that we can formally announce without getting in trouble at this time.
Yeah.
That's fine. Well, thanks for being with me today, Libby and John. And yeah, I look forward to seeing all of the next work that is coming up from your co-led work group at the Jacobs Foundation.
It's awesome. Great to speak. Thanks so much, Luigi.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.